It's awesome to be here today, guys. Thank you so much for having me. And like Travis said, my name is Kylie, and I am part of this movement, this mighty movement of God called Foster the City. And so are you. Foster the City is a coalition of churches. They are churches like yours who are here saying there are far more children entering into the foster care system than there are loving homes to welcome them in. And these are churches who are saying, not on my watch. Right? Your churches who are responding to this crisis that social workers are telling us about, that we need families, loving families. And the beautiful part is that while we want to see the church raise up foster families, we also know God uniquely created us, as Travis just said, so differently with this calling on us. Thinking of Romans 12, where we're talked about the many bodies of Christ, right? The many parts of the body that create the body of Christ. We all have giftings that we can offer towards vulnerable children and families who are in need. And so while we need foster families to actually welcome in the children, we also need foster families to be surrounded with a community, which this is where the church shines, right? We are naturally people who crave and live in community. And this is what we want to see, every foster family wrapped with support friends. And so I'm going to be able to share a little bit more about that. But first, I want to dive in to the text a little bit. And I want to share, and let's dive in and see where Jesus just showed us how to do this first and how to do this best. And I just think today is an honor to be able to stand here in Foster Care Awareness Month, to be able to provide a spot and an opportunity for us to speak on behalf of those who don't have the opportunity to speak up this way, who are in the trenches of trauma and trying to survive and fight to get their families back, where they don't have the wherewithal to pause and come and invite others in. And we do. And so thank you for listening. And I'm just asking the Holy Spirit just to meet us here today. God, may we just be open-handed today with the sermon, with your text, God, with anybody who's here, God. May we just be open-handed and be moved as you compel us to. And so we're going to start off in Mark 1, 40 through 42. And I'm just going to read it. Let's go. It says, "Then a man with leprosy came to him, Jesus, and on his knees begged him, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. 'I am willing,' he told him, 'be made clean.' And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean." Now, the first thing I want to kind of point out here is this illness called leprosy. In historical context, in this time, it was a pretty prevalent disease, and it covered your entire body. It was oozing, and it was painful. And anybody who had this, the most painful part about it was that you were ostracized and you were asked to leave society. You weren't allowed to be around your family. You weren't allowed to be welcomed into the city walls. You were actually filled with so much shame that nobody wanted to be around you. And many times, actually, it was believed that this disease was given to you as a curse from God. People believed that you had this disease because you sinned, or maybe it was your parents before you who sinned. And so you're walking in this shame, isolation, apart from everybody who's ever loved you, and told that you cannot be part of this. You cannot come and dine at my table. You cannot be here in my presence with my family. And I think for the first time, a lot of us can kind of relate to that, right, in a whole new way, thinking of the pandemic and what we just walked through. And I think we can have empathy in a way where we can see what isolation does to people. Where I don't know about you guys, if anybody here familiar with the 5 love languages. If you are, one of them's touch. That's like number 5 for me. It's not high up. But even I felt the profound absence of closeness with my brothers and sisters, my parents, my best friends. While we were coming out of shelter in place, I almost wept just being around others again. How much I'd missed greeting each other with a hug or sharing hard news with somebody and having them be able to put their arm around me, or the need of mighty prayers from family members, or maybe I needed to pray for others and being able to put our hands on them. We are people who are meant to do life together. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. We all just walked through this together. But I just think it's good to take a step back and think, if we experienced that little bit of isolation during shelter in place and throughout this pandemic, and maybe some of us still are because we're immunocompromised or still protecting others in our home, I just want you to know, what was it like for this man walking in this amount of isolation and then the shame on top of it? And so when I read verse 2, I find myself thinking almost what we just talked about during worship today, that posture. When I read verse Verse 40 again, it talks about how the leper fell to his knees and begged Jesus to make him clean. It was his posture. It was like his spirit crying out and saying, God, if you are willing, Jesus, if you are willing, touch me, heal me. Do it if you are willing. And I just think, what was he asking for? And how did Jesus meet his needs? When I read this out of this desperation, and based on what we know historically about leprosy, right, in those days, we just know that he was asking for physical healing. He wants the pain gone. He wants his body restored. But what he also was asking for was for that healing touch so he could be restored back to his family. He was saying, God, put me back with those that I love. And Jesus' response is so profound. He was moved with compassion, not duty, not law, not religion. There was nothing there except for just this compassion, which literally means to suffer with. Compassion, to suffer with. He was moved by that. He was willing to get down where this man was. He knew what he was feeling because he's God, right? He knows our hearts. He knows our longings. And instead of speaking the miracle over this man, which we saw earlier in the chapter of Mark, we saw that he spoke and an unclean spirit was moved from a person. We see it later on in the same chapter where he speaks and a lame man is able to get up and walk. But this time he ushered in the healing by touching him first. He moved past social norms. He said, I'm going to touch the untouchable. I'm going to touch the unclean. And I'm going to show that I'm going to meet. I don't know about you guys. I'm speculating here. But when I think of some of those first hugs I had and those interactions with people after coming out of shelter in place, it just felt like different and new and special. And to think of this man with leprosy, how long has it been since somebody lovingly touched him? And yet Jesus touched him first. He met him there, and then he spoke the blessing of the healing over him. And I just think this is the Jesus that we get to serve. This is the Jesus who speaks to us about what justice is. And this is the Jesus who is so relational that he'll do whatever it takes to get to us, to meet us where we are and bring in that healing. And this is the Jesus who we get to be the image bearers of and do the same. And so I just think that when I look at this and I see how Jesus was moved by compassion, we get to be moved into action with the compassion of Jesus too. And, the early church was really good at this. I think about the profoundness of walking alongside Jesus and seeing the resurrection and then moving into when he ascended into heaven and just what it must have been like to be a Christian in those times. And there was a tradition that was going on actually in this time that was totally allowed. We see the church loving people really well throughout the books of Acts, but we also see in textbooks outside of the Bible, right? And there was this tradition that was allowed in the Roman Empire where if a child was born, the mother had the chance to go and place this child at the feet of their parent, the father. And the father had two options. He could go down, scoop up the child, and legitimize them. That's what we call somebody being a legitimate child. It's the father's accepting him, saying, yes, this is my child. You are added to my family. Or on the other side, a father could dismiss the child and say, it's for whatever reason. There was no reason even needed to be given. Maybe the wrong gender. Maybe the child had a disability. Maybe it was just inconvenient timing for the family or their family of poverty, and they didn't feel like they could provide for this child. So then this child will then be picked up and moved outside the city walls, where the child will be placed to be exposed to the elements or animals. And this was socially acceptable, and this was fine, except to God's people. It wasn't fine to the Christians. In fact, they would go out into the night, and they would listen for the cries of the children, and they would find them and pick them up and bring them back home and care for them just as God has cared for them. And they would move on in this legacy of being moved by compassion and saying, not here, not with these children who are beloved children of God. And can I tell you something so profound about this story? Because this story is our legacy, right? This is Christian followers following Jesus for generations to come. And we are right there in that legacy maker realm. Because we don't have to walk through the streets to find the cries or listen for the cries of the children who are vulnerable, because the county social workers are sending us their names. They're telling us where these children are and who they need to be loved by, and it's foster families. And I think even the more miraculous part of this is that these children's cries are not coming alone. We aren't just listening for the cries of the children, but we get to listen for the cries of the first family too. Because their parents are crying out. They are not abandoned children. These are children who are in homes that are dearly loved by their parents, but their parents are on a whole different side of warring against addiction or domestic violence or living in a lifestyle that they themselves were raised in, and it's the only way they know how to parent. And so I think the miracle in this day and age of being able to say yes to engaging with foster care is that we get to love on these children while we get to fiercely pray for the restoration of their first families. Because that's what foster care is. It's families loving families. Just referring back to Mark 2 for a second, I think the verse where it talks about where Jesus is moved by compassion is beautiful. But there's also another translation that says he was indignant. He was moved with this sense of righteous anger. And I don't believe he's saying this to the leper who's coming to him, right, with this posture of just humility and, Father, heal me. Jesus, heal me. I think it was him crying out and giving us a peek into how much he can't stand the brokenness of this world. That he was saying, sickness should not be in your body. The brokenness of this world should not prevail. Isn't that why Jesus came? And he was just showing us just time after time about how he pursues after those who he loves. You know, another time when he was indignant in the Gospels is when it was when the disciples were telling the children not to come close to him. You know, when the parents are ushering the children, and he, with indignation, he pushes the disciples aside and says, no, the kingdom of heaven is for them as well, and he welcomes them in. And when I think of how loved those children were and how Jesus just fought for them in that moment to give them space at his feet, to bless them and love him, how much more is he fighting for those who are vulnerable and on the outskirts and aren't having access to him in the way where we as Christians want everybody to have access to him. And so I think that this is where we as the church get to just shine Jesus. And it's because we, as his image bearers, get to usher in with indignant passion and moved by compassion, saying the world is not supposed to be this way, so God, use me to usher in your healing. And, you know, and in foster care, we talk about the healing touch of God is actually called something called attachment. And it's so profound, this language of attachment. What it means is that you are giving your family, yourself, to this child so that they can feel trust and love, and they can attach to you and continue to flourish and grow while their families are waiting to be restored. I want to share a quick story. My family and I, we've been support friends for Foster the City for a few years now, and it has just been one of the greatest joys in my family's lives. We believe in doing ministry together, so we bring in our 3 children, my husband and I, and we get to serve along. We've had the privilege of serving along a few foster families over the years, but one family in particular I just want to share about is a single woman who felt like she knew God was calling her to be a foster mom. But she wanted to wait for the perfect timing. You know, thought maybe when I'm married or have a couple kids of my own or I have a house that's big enough. And she said, in her own words, that there's one moment where God just asked her, are you going to obey or are you going to wait? And so she was moved by compassion when she heard about the need for children to have loving homes and said, I'm not waiting any longer, God, let's do this. So her and God together, they walked through, got the approval process, and she'd fostered a few kids, but she welcomed in one little boy. We're going to call him Baby M. She welcomed him in 2020, right? July 2020, which what a wild time to open your home to somebody else, right? When the whole world is closing our doors and we're sheltering in place, trying to make sure we're able to be safe and not pass on this virus, she's opening up her door and welcoming in outside people. And it was just profound. It was a moment where my husband and I knew you aren't going to be able to do this alone, so let's get those support friends wrapped around you. And this is the time when you guys remember with our bubbles, and so we kind of like got together and said, we'll be in your bubble if you'll be in our bubble, and we can make sure we can help meet some of your needs in person, since she's an essential worker and we knew she'd have to go into work. And so a few weeks in, she said, yep, I'm going to need some help. And so she called us and asked us to help about watching her little boy. And her little boy was about my boy's age, and so when she dropped him off, my husband and I were holding the 2 boys, kind of bouncing around, and we put them in the playpen for a minute to let them play while we're getting their snacks ready. And as soon as I put my guy down and I turn the corner to walk to the kitchen, he starts just screaming. You know how that is? You put your kid down and you're like, just give me a few seconds. I'm almost there. So I kind of run back in, scoop him up, and started to soothe him. And then I realized something really eerie happening afterwards. It was completely silent in the room. And I looked down, and baby boy M was just sitting there staring up at me. And I looked around and thought, okay, he's just staring at me. Okay, maybe he needs something. And the rest of the time we were together, he didn't make a sound. And as a support friend, it's not my role to ask the foster family a lot of questions. I don't get to ask, why is this child in care, or tell me about their backstory. It's my job to love them right where they are. That's what I get to do as a support friend. I get to love the foster family and help meet some of their needs, to carry some of that burden. So I don't know the whole story behind this child's story before they came into foster care. But what we do know is that oftentimes children who experience neglect, they learn early on that when they cry out, their needs aren't going to be met, so they stop crying. And as a Christian, when I think of how when I cry out to my God and my Father and He answers me, what is that like for a 10-month-old baby? Or maybe on the other side, maybe his needs were being met, but the trauma of being removed from his mom and entering into foster care and sitting on my living room floor, I'm a stranger to him. Maybe he's looking around wondering, where are my safe people? Are you safe? Can I trust you with my cry? And I've had the chance to get to know his mom now on this side of things, and I know how much she fiercely loves him. So don't misinterpret this in any way of saying he was not loved, because he was, and his mom was just going through her own battles, and she needed some help, and he needed a chance to bond and attach. And so this foster mom just kept loving on this boy, and we got to be a part of this as well. And a couple months later, I don't really remember the timeline, it's been a while, but we brought this little boy home, baby boy M again, and into our house, and we're loving on him. And same thing, my husband and I have him when we put him in the playpen, and I go into the kitchen to go ahead and make a snack, and instantly baby M starts just wailing, that beautiful someone come pick me up kind of cry. And I was so startled, and I went over and picked him up. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, is this attachment? And my 3.5-year-old, she stops and she says, Mommy, last time baby M was here and you put him down, he didn't cry. Now when you put him down, he cries. And I kid you not, her phrase was, it's almost like he's used to being held now. And church, if that can be our reputation, to be people who go and meet others right where they are, allow attachment to be there first and foremost, to meet their needs, and then to speak the healing of Jesus over them, what a mighty and beautiful reputation that is. Is that not Jesus? And what a beautiful picture of the faith of a child for a 3.5-year-old to bring me into that moment. And I was just reminded that this is how Jesus operates. This is how God the Father operates. That when Jesus was here, he ushered in the healing, but not exclusively, right? He oftentimes sent out the disciples. He's taught people. He said, watch me and go and do it yourself. When we look throughout the Old Testament, we see Moses, an entire nation of people enslaved, asking and crying out to God, and God used Moses to go and free them. Someone who said, I'm not able, I'm not worthy. I look on and I see Esther needing her family to encourage her that this is your calling. You were created for such a time as this. Go and give God's people a chance to defend themselves. And she did. Or I look in the New Testament with Peter, who denied Jesus after walking with him so closely, and yet God still built his church upon him. The text is full of ordinary people like you and me doing extraordinary things because we are choosing to be moved by compassion, and we're using that to compel us into action to be Jesus to this world. And that is exactly what we experienced with baby M. We saw the healing power of God through this foster mom who was just willing to be used. This foster mom didn't just speak healing over him. Instead, she chose to meet him where he was and say, hey, baby boy, the way you've been surviving, the survival mode, it's not how it's supposed to be. Let me just meet you here, and let's heal together. This reminds me of the next verse that I'd love to highlight is James 1:27. You'll be able to see it up here on the slide behind me, but I'll read it too. And it reads, pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, this verse shares the Father's heart for us, right? It shows the Father's heart for us and for those who are marginalized. And something about, context of Scripture, it's great to know that in this day and age, kids in foster care are not orphans, but that doesn't exclude them from this, right? Because orphans in that time were children who had no covering, nobody to provide for them. They were oftentimes women who were not sheltered by a man, right? Society in that time meant you had to have a man providing for you. And so these were people who were left without family. And that's exactly who children in foster care are. I cannot think of a more vulnerable population than children who are being removed from their family of origin and entered into a system that's, guys, it's a broken system because it's run by people and we're broken people. And so we need to have grace and love, and we need to have people jumping into it to defend and to speak up and to fight and advocate for these families. But then I also love that in the second part of that verse, it talks about to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained of the world. Unstained from the world. This part's really convicting to me because while I think we all here can say, okay, we love Jesus and we know we're supposed to live in this world but not of it, I don't think this part of the verse is necessarily saying the moral corruption of the world, or maybe some of kind of the extreme voices that the generations behind us love to say for young people this day and age raising children, how hard it is and how hard it must be. And sure, every generation has their things that we're working on. But I actually think this is talking about the enticing lulling of the world. And when I think here in the Silicon Valley, what is that? Oftentimes we're living in such a way where we're efficient, we're really good at making things comfortable, or maybe we're seeking that Silicon Valley dream, right? The IPO startup, whatever that looks like, we're striving. We're striving and we're protecting and we're holding on to oftentimes. And yet this verse is telling us to not be unstained, right? To be set apart from the world, because what God says for us to do oftentimes does not align exactly with how the world is telling us to do it. And when we think of the inconvenience of loving those who are from different areas or a different background, a different culture, a different race, what that looks like, it can be inconvenient to us to have to learn, to have to sit with, to love. And I think this is what Jesus is saying to us. When was the last time you were moved by compassion and acted when it was inconvenient even to love somebody else? And in fact, all throughout the book of Mark, I love reading the Gospels. There are moments where I'm just like, God, I just need to be reminded of your love for me, for others. Just remind me. And just reading through it. And throughout the book of Mark, one thing that I was recently just reading through it, and I noticed how many miracles were done through an interruption. The woman who was bleeding and thinking about how she reached out and grabbed the hem of Jesus' coat, how she just reached out. Do you know where he was going? To heal a child who was dying. That's a really good cause. That's a really good thing to be going after and to be dead set on. And yet he stopped and still took time to turn and acknowledge her presence when women were not acknowledged often, especially a woman as ill as her with an unclean illness. And he loved her, healed her, saw her where she was, and then continued on with what was called to do next. How often and how willing are we to pause what we're doing to love those who are right here around us who are hurting? And it's going to be inconvenient for us as Christians, right? We've lived this life a while. We know it's not going to be perfect. But when we think about what it looks like when the church says yes to being James 1:27, what is God going to do through his people, right? And so you'll see here on the next slide, kids who age out of the foster care system without attachment, without that healing power of God, right? Where they're able to bond to an adult and know that somebody is sitting there saying, hey, I've got you. You make a mistake, I'm still here. Something goes wrong, doesn't matter, I'm here. You can do nothing that will make me not love you. When children don't have somebody like that in their lives, these stats are their outcome. 71% of girls will be pregnant by the time that they're 21. When I look at the unhoused population, 33% of them have spent time in foster care. Sex trafficking. So many of us are passionate about anti-sex traffic work. 65% of kids who were pulled from a raid that were being pimped out spent time in foster care. Guys, these statistics go on and on. You have a heart for racial reconciliation? Kids of color who enter into foster care? They are more likely to be moved around from homes and homes and not to be reunified. What would it look like if we had families advocating for those families and speaking up on their behalf? This outcome is devastating. And I know this is the church again that says, not on my watch. And so again, this is what happens when kids are not attached to a family or an adult or somebody who's there their whole lives. So what would it look like if we kept people, I look at this and I think, oh my gosh, so many churches are engaging in unhoused population, anti-sex trafficking, helping kids get jobs, helping women get resources to keep their children. There's so much goodness happening. We need people staying in this right now because there's real adults that are hurting there. But also, what would it look like if we kept going upstream? And that's what foster care is. I was talking to a foster mom, and she said, I have a passion for anti-sex trafficking. She's been involved with a lot of ministries for a lot of years, and she said, but the minute I heard of foster care and that this is upstream for that, it just broke my heart in a whole new way I didn't even know it could break. And that's why she became a foster mom. So all of us have our expressions of justice, and they are good, but what would it look like? What would it look like if the church kept going upstream? What would San Francisco look like in 10 years if we were caring for kids in foster care the way that they deserve to be cared for? I believe firmly, this next slide, that the best way to transform our cities is to care for these vulnerable children today, right now, opening up our homes to these kids. And this is exactly what we are doing. This is what we're seeing happen. And it's churches like yours who are responding to this crisis. And this is why we're going to see God just transform our cities. I had heard a social worker say one time, she said, we need all kinds of families for all kinds of kids. She said, we need foster families who are coming in their retired years. Can you imagine spending your retirement that way? We have a family here who does. She said that when her and her husband retired and they had spare rooms, she said, what better way to do this than to pour into a child, a teen specifically, they're choosing teenagers, but to pour in and love on them during this time where we don't have the burden of work or anything else on our minds. How present can we be to them? That's not retirement in the world's eyes. That's retirement in the kingdom's eyes. Or we need families who are willing to say yes to siblings, thinking about the trauma of being removed from your family of origin and then to be separated from your siblings. When I think about that, my goodness, my siblings, how tight am I with them? We need families to stay together as much as possible, which means siblings together. And we live in San Francisco. I mean, you guys do. We're here in San Francisco, right? Housing and space, it's hard. Can we be inconvenienced and maybe rework our rooms? I was listening to a foster family, one of our Foster City families here. She was sharing that they flopped rooms with their kids so that they could take the smaller room so they could make room for another child to come into their home. Talk about being inconvenienced for the name of the gospel. We need single households to become foster families. When my friend was going through the approval process that I was sharing about earlier, she said, she was talking about how sometimes children, when they experience abuse or trauma, the trigger is actually just being around somebody from that gender. And so if it's been a man that has beat them, or they experienced or saw their mom being beat by a man, being in a household with just a woman can be the most secure attachment and bonding and beautiful way for God to restore this part of their lives. We need single families. We need old families. We need young families. We need families who have the same culture of kids who are entering into care, so that that's a whole other layer of trauma that's not being added onto them. It's this beautiful picture where we see the church being of every tribe and nation coming alongside these children. And it excites me to think that we are doing this together. And so, and that's exactly what it is. We are seeing churches. And so this next slide, you'll see this beautiful picture of the church coming alongside these foster families and having this team of support friends wrap around them. And when I think of community in the context of being inconvenienced daily, because that's what foster families are being asked to do. They're jumping around schedules and they're loving on biofamily and they're thinking of these kids and maybe their own kids. There's so many things to juggle that when you're doing this and then you have a team of 3 or 4 people who are saying, hey, I see you. I know what God's called you to do and I know it's hard, but we're here to carry some of that with you. Let me be somebody who holds some of the burden. Let me be somebody who holds some of the joy. Let me be somebody who holds some of the hope when it feels hopeless for you. And let me be somebody here who can grieve with you, because sometimes things in foster care don't go the way we hope for. And it's okay to feel that grief. But this is where support friends are. You're not somebody who says, hey, I heard you got a placement. Oh my gosh, I love what you're doing. Text me if you need help. No. Support friends are not that. We are people on a mission who say, you have a placement. I know how to do this. Let me show up and help you. And this is what the church is doing. And you have this advocate here, right here at Canvas. You guys, this ministry is already here and set up. Brittany, who's a foster mom herself here, she is here to facilitate that and to be the advocate in this role who's going to help with the support friends and foster families. But we need people who are courageous enough to say yes to this expression of God's justice and love for these kids. And I think that something is absolutely profound and beautiful with the timing of Foster Care Awareness Month is that it comes right after Easter. Right after a season where we're celebrating the goodness of God, where we're celebrating the power of the resurrection, the death on the cross for my sins, and then he rose again so that I may be redeemed and in relationship with my God, my Father. What a mighty power it is to compel us and move us so that we can be the gospel, where we can say it is better to give than it is to receive when we're loving on first families who maybe don't even have the capacity to thank you for caring for their kids because they're fighting. They're fighting to get these kids back into their home. When I think about how we are not limited anymore to old religion, to the old ways, to just things that we have to do, but it's by this compassion. I just think it's a beautiful picture of how we get to just continue to love our neighbors and not send them away. We get to love our neighbors as ourselves. You know, here in San Francisco County, guys, before the pandemic, over half the kids who were entering into foster care were being sent out of county to another county because there were not enough homes to welcome them. That's not loving our neighbor. That's sending them to somebody else and saying, go love my neighbor for me. And I want to see that switched. You want to see that switched. I love that. And that's where the power of the resurrection, because the only way we can be compelled to stay in this and to do this with the fullness of God is when we remember we are redeemed ourselves and God has done this mighty work in us. So let us stay faithful and let us have this long obedience in the same direction, as Eugene Peterson calls it, of just following Jesus. And the next slide, there's this verse that I just love when I think of where it talks about, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and sound judgment. Some verses say power, love, and a sound mind. And to me, this feels like awakening of the power of the resurrection, where Jesus came not to be served, but to serve others. And then to, with the joy set before him, endure the cross for us. That's the power that we get to do. This love, the unconditional love that God has had for us, we get to have for others. And then a sound judgment, a sound mind, not a worldly mind, but a mind that's compelled and motivated by Christ, where we get to say, God, this doesn't make sense to the world, but I'm going to do it anyways. And then we continue on in those verses where Paul's talking to Timothy, and he says, so do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord or of his prisoner. Rather, join with me in the suffering from the gospel by the power of God. He has saved us all and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace. God is calling on us through his apostle Paul to be reminded of what was accomplished at the cross and to let it sustain us, and that we can be like Jesus. And when we think of what it's like for these children and their family of origin to know that they are beloved children of God, and we get to look on them as brothers and sisters who are image bearers of Jesus, that we get to ask them to join in on our family, and we get to join be part of their family. To me, it feels like it's a reminder that it's not because of anything we've done, but because of what God did through us first. So I'm going to close quickly with this story of just this reminder that this is a movement of God, because oftentimes when we're asked to, maybe it's to realign our expression of justice, or maybe God's disrupting something in us, or maybe you just feel the Holy Spirit asking you right now, what are you moved by compassion? What is the action I'm asking you to do? It can be scary, because I know some of us, my husband and I, we sat in and listened to a vision cast, and I remember him saying, oh God, I can feel my wife, who's an 8 on the Enneagram, just being moved by this justice. Please don't make this be the expression you're asking us to do. And now he's the one who's leading the way, because he's so caught on and he sees how much God loves these children. And so I believe that when we pray and say, God, if you're asking me to do this, we have to believe God's going before us. And I believe that's true here in San Francisco. In fact, I have a story. When we were first expanding to San Francisco County, somebody made a comment to one of the founders and said, don't skip San Francisco, please. So many nonprofits or ministries or churches don't want to plant here or start here because the need is too great, and you're going to be constantly told about how many challenges we have going against us, and how much unhoused populations and drugs, and there's so many things here. Where do you even begin? And she said, so don't overlook our county. Come here, please. She's asking the church to engage. And then she goes on and says this. She said, I had a dream, social worker, right? I had a dream that my children that I care for were in a building. And something about the building was unsafe, and so they were literally jumping out of the building because that was safer than staying in there. And she said, I was running around trying to catch these children, and I could not do it alone. I could not catch every child who was jumping out of the window. And then she said, but there was a moment in my dream where I was told to turn and look around. And she said, and when I did, I saw a crowd of people running towards me with their arms out, getting ready to help me catch these children. And she stopped and said, and I think that's you guys. And she wasn't saying that to the Fossa City leaders. She was saying that to the local San Francisco church. She believes the church is the solution. And God went before us and gave a dream to this woman to open her heart to saying yes to families who know Jesus so intimately that we want to love others just as big as we've been loved by God. And so even though this is just a dream, it's not just a dream, it was a profound dream. And we can't walk out of this sanctuary today and go down to this building and see the faces of these children who are jumping out for relief and safety. I believe that if we could, I think there's a family here who would say, yes, I will take that 5-year-old, let me catch them. I believe there's a single woman here who says, that teenager, she's mine, and would catch him. Because this is a church who knows who they are created by and are compelled to do what Jesus did. And so when I think of the foster families who are going to be raised up here, when I think of the support friends who are going to be raised up here, I thank God when I think of you, Canvas SF. I thank God when I think of what the mighty movement, of how saturated this church is and full of God's love, and what it's going to look like when it just rains down on your city. And so Brittany and I, we're going to be here today to invite you. If you want to come alongside us, we're not asking you for any commitment. Maybe some of you feel like God's asking you to say yes to some big things, but right now we're just saying one step at a time. So we'd love to invite you just to this interest meeting. Just come. If you want to grab your cameras out or your phone, scan it. Those of you who are online, this is for you to ease access of RSVPing, or come join us at the table after here. Brittany, your advocate, and I, we're going to be out there with another team member, and we would love to talk with you, get to know you a little bit more, help you take those next steps with us, because oftentimes the first step of faithfulness is where God meets us, not beforehand. When we are saying, God, I'm going to go and have faith that you will meet me in that next step. And so I just want to leave us with this blessing. It's this blessing of St. Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks, compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands. Yours are the feet. Yours are the eyes. Yours are his body. Christ has no body now but yours. Father, may this just be the prayer of Canvas SF, God. May this just be the prayer where we just praise you, God, for the body you have given us, the breath in our lungs that's yours, God. May we breathe in your life and be compelled to be your people, God, who are living out your mission here in our city. We love you, God.